Good evening, fellow adventurers. How are you today? I hope you're doing well and ready to journey through time together with Nightly Historian. In the spring of 1943, when Europe was wrapped in smoke and silence, a strange idea began to form in a quiet London office. It was not a plan to attack, nor a plan to defend. It was a plan to deceive, to win a battle without firing a single shot. The British intelligence service, exhausted by years of brutal conflict, knew that victory would depend not just on strength, but on imagination. And in a small, dimly lit room within the Admiralty, two officers were about to imagine the impossible. One of them was Ewen Montagu, a lawyer by training, calm in demeanor, analytical in thought, the kind of man who measured truth as if it were evidence in court. The other was Charles Cholmondeley, tall, eccentric, a dreamer who loved improbable ideas. Together, they formed the unlikely pair behind one of the most extraordinary operations of the Second World War, a deception so bold and bizarre it seemed to belong more to fiction than to strategy. Their mission was born from a simple but terrifying truth. The Allies needed to invade southern Europe, but the Axis command believed they would strike at Greece or Sardinia. The real target was Sicily, the soft underbelly of Europe. If the Axis command prepared there, the invasion would end in disaster. But if they could be convinced the Allies were heading somewhere else, perhaps the beaches of Sicily would be left unguarded. Deception had always been a part of war, but this would require something new, something human, believable, and impossible to trace back to its creators. Montagu leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the faint smell of pipe smoke lingering in the air. He said softly, "What if we could make them believe something through a person who doesn't exist?" Cholmondeley raised an eyebrow. "A ghost?" he asked. "Not quite," Montagu replied. "A man, but one who can't speak, can't betray us, and can't ever come back." The silence between them was heavy. The concept was morbid, even grotesque. Yet within it lay the seed of genius.
It read, "I do love you, my darling. If only this frightful war would end, we could finally have that cottage we dream of." It was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, but Montagu knew that human touches made lies believable. "The smallest details," he once said, "are often the most convincing." Next came the documents, the core of the illusion. Inside his briefcase would be letters between Allied commanders discussing plans to invade Greece and Sardinia. Nothing about Sicily. Each letter was carefully worded, plausible, but not theatrical. They hinted at strategy without spelling it out, leaving just enough for Axis analysts to discover what they thought was a secret. Cholmondeley mused over the deception. It's not about what you show them. It's about what they choose to believe. The hardest part was making sure the body seemed recently drowned. For that, they packed it in dry ice and transported it secretly in a steel canister marked optical equipment. At night, under dim light, the small team of officers and pathologists stood in silence as they completed their grim preparations. What they were doing was both brilliant and unsettling. They were about to send a man into war, a man who would never know he was fighting it. By late April 1943, the submarine HMS Seraph slipped quietly from the Scottish coast, carrying the canister aboard. Commander Bill Jewell, who captained the vessel, knew only the basics of the plan. Montagu had briefed him. Handle this as if it were a living officer. Treat him with the respect of one. The men on board called the canister the man who never was. On April 30th, just before dawn, the Seraph surfaced near the Spanish coast. The air was cold and the sea calm. The officers said a brief prayer, then slid the body into the water, watching as the waves carried it away. In his breast pocket, Major William Martin carried his love letter, his identification, and a briefcase that could change the course of history. Hours later, as the sun rose over Huelva, Spain, a fisherman spotted something floating in the surf. A British officer, face pale, uniform soaked, the sea gently rocking him against the tide. Local authorities arrived quickly. The paper seemed important. The body, after all, carried the markings of an Allied officer. Soon, the information reached Spanish naval intelligence, and from there, as Montagu and Cholmondeley had predicted, to the German command. In Berlin, the documents were analyzed with excitement and suspicion. Could this be the key to the Allies' next move? The letters were studied, copied, and eventually returned to the British, as was customary between neutral governments. But by then, the damage was done. The copies had already reached the Axis High Command. Back in London, the deception team waited in silence. They had no way of knowing if the ruse had worked. They could only watch the movements of the enemy and hope. For days, intercepted communications told a story too good to be true. Troops were being redirected from Sicily to Greece. Reinforcements shifted across the Mediterranean.
It read, "I do love you, my darling. If only this frightful war would end, we could finally have that cottage we dream of." It was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, but Montagu knew that human touches made lies believable. The smallest details, he once said, are often the most convincing. Next came the documents, the core of the illusion. Inside his briefcase would be letters between Allied commanders discussing plans to invade Greece and Sardinia. Nothing about Sicily. Each letter was carefully worded, plausible but not theatrical. They hinted at strategy without spelling it out, leaving just enough for Axis analysts to discover what they thought was a secret. Cholmondeley mused over the deception. It's not about what you show them. It's about what they choose to believe. The hardest part was making sure the body seemed recently drowned. For that, they packed it in dry ice and transported it secretly in a steel canister marked optical equipment. At night, under dim light, the small team of officers and pathologists stood in silence as they completed their grim preparations. What they were doing was both brilliant and unsettling. They were about to send a man into war, a man who would never know he was fighting it. By late April 1943, the submarine HMS Seraph slipped quietly from the Scottish coast, carrying the canister aboard. Commander Bill Jewell, who captained the vessel, knew only the basics of the plan. Montagu had briefed him, "Handle this as if it were a living officer. Treat him with the respect of one."
The men on board called the canister the man who never was. On April 30th, just before dawn, the Seraph surfaced near the Spanish coast. The air was cold and the sea calm. The officers said a brief prayer, then slid the body into the water, watching as the waves carried it away. In his breast pocket, Major William Martin carried his love letter, his identification, and a briefcase that could change the course of history. Hours later, as the sun rose over Huelva, Spain, a fisherman spotted something floating in the surf. A British officer, face pale, uniform soaked, the sea gently rocking him against the tide. Local authorities arrived quickly. The paper seemed important.
The body, after all, carried the markings of an Allied officer. Soon the information reached Spanish naval intelligence, and from there, as Montagu and Cholmondeley had predicted, to the German command. In Berlin, the documents were analyzed with excitement and suspicion. Could this be the key to the Allies' next move? The letters were studied, copied, and eventually returned to the British, as was customary between neutral governments. But by then, the damage was done. The copies had already reached the Axis High Command. Back in London, the deception team waited in silence. They had no way of knowing if the ruse had worked. They could only watch the movements of the enemy and hope. For days, intercepted communications told a story too good to be true. Troops were being redirected from Sicily to Greece. Reinforcements shifted across the Mediterranean.
Montagu received the first intelligence summary confirming their success. He simply exhaled, said nothing, and looked out the window. "They believed it," he whispered. Cholmondeley grinned. "Then the man who never was has just won a battle." Operation Mincemeat had worked beyond imagination. The dead man's documents had been accepted as genuine. The German leadership believed that the Allied invasion would strike Greece. When the real Allied forces landed on Sicily in July 1943, resistance was far lighter than expected. The deception had bought them time and lives. Montagu later reflected, "We won not through force, but through faith. Their faith in what we allowed them to see." The success was not just strategic, but psychological. It proved that even in war, truth could be reshaped, not through weapons, but through imagination. For months afterward, the story of Major William Martin lived on within intelligence circles. The Germans never suspected they had been deceived by a man who never lived. Montagu attended a quiet service for the unknown man buried in Huelva. The grave bore the inscription, "William Martin, Major, Royal Marines, served his country faithfully." He stood there in silence, the sound of waves nearby, the wind carrying the scent of salt and memory. "He did serve," Montagu murmured. "He did." And as the tide rose once more along the Spanish shore, the man who never was, the man who fooled an empire, became a legend not written in blood, but in belief.
In London, inside the gray stone walls of the Admiralty, Ewen Montagu sat in quiet reflection. The operation had succeeded, but victory brought no celebration, only relief, and a strange unease that lingered in the corners of his mind. For every successful deception, there was always a shadow, the knowledge that real men would die because others believed in a lie. And that, Montagu knew, would never sit easily with him. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling in the lamplight, and thought of the nameless man they had used. He wondered what his life had been, what dreams he might have had before the war claimed him twice. Charles Cholmondeley entered the room with a file under his arm. "We've just received confirmation from intercepts. They've moved divisions out of Sicily. It's working perfectly." Montagu nodded slowly. "Perfectly," he repeated, although the word sounded heavy. "You realize, Charles, somewhere in Greece, men are now preparing for a battle that will never come." Cholmondeley paused. "And because of that, others will live, perhaps thousands." His voice softened. "That's war, Ewen. Lies that save lives." Montagu managed a faint smile. "Lies that save lives," he echoed. as if testing the phrase against his conscience. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the deception had taken root. German intelligence officers examined the recovered letters with a mixture of pride and suspicion. The details felt genuine, the tone believable. One officer wrote in his report, "The contents bear every mark of authenticity. The couriers likely drowned while en route to North Africa." Even the smallest inconsistencies, a smudge of ink, a fold in the paper, had been carefully designed by Montagu's team. To the enemy analysts, these imperfections made the documents seem real.
The human mind, after all, trusts flaws more than perfection. That was the brilliance of Operation Mincemeat. It didn't try to look flawless. It tried to look human. In Berlin, senior staff debated the letters in long, smoke-filled meetings. Some officers argued that it could be a trick. Others dismissed the thought. The British, one reportedly said, would never risk such an elaborate fabrication. It was true. No one imagined the Allies capable of such audacity. It seemed too absurd, too cinematic to be real. And that was exactly why it worked. The human brain, in times of fear, seeks patterns that confirm its expectations. The Axis command expected an invasion of Greece, and the documents confirmed exactly that. In Madrid, the documents passed through several hands: Spanish officials, naval attachés, local intermediaries, each adding their own layer of secrecy and curiosity. The body itself had been buried with military honors by Spanish authorities, a respectful act, and, ironically, the final detail that completed the illusion. Montagu later wrote, "It was almost poetic that our fiction was given a burial fit for a hero." Weeks later, British intelligence intercepted coded reports confirming that the Germans had accepted the deception entirely. The trap was set. When Allied troops landed on the shores of Sicily on July 9, 1933, they faced only half the resistance that had been predicted. The rest of the enemy's strength had been diverted north. From the decks of landing ships, soldiers watched artillery flashes over distant hills, unaware that a single dead man had made their passage possible.
In the days that followed, Allied commanders praised the efficiency of the intelligence divisions. But the men behind Mincemeat remained silent. Their victory had to stay secret. Secrecy was, after all, both their weapon and their burden. In a private note to his wife, Montagu wrote, "I sometimes wonder what it means to play God with truth. Perhaps it is necessary, but it is not easy." Charles, ever the optimist, responded with humor. "History won't remember the method," he said one evening over a pint, "only the result, and that result will be a free Europe." Montagu smiled faintly. "You have more faith in history than I do, Charles." But history, as it turned out, would remember both. By late summer, the Allies had taken Sicily. Mussolini had been removed from power, and the German leadership was scrambling to adapt to a war that was slipping beyond their control. Some within their ranks began to question how they could have been so easily deceived. One general wrote bitterly, "We were outwitted not by armies, but by ideas." It was a confession Montagu would have found fitting. In London, the secret team quietly celebrated with a modest glass of sherry. There was laughter, brief and subdued, before everyone returned to work on new operations. For deception, once proven effective, becomes as vital a weapon as any bomb. And so, even as Mincemeat faded from the headlines, the lessons it taught lived on. In code-breaking rooms, in espionage manuals, in the invisible war of minds that defined the 20th century. Montagu carried the memory of Major Martin with him long after. To him, the success was not just professional, it was personal, a reminder of how fragile truth can be when shaped by purpose. He often visited the grave in Huelva when passing through Spain after the war. Locals said he would stand quietly, hat in hand, as though speaking to the man who had never spoken back. A Spanish gardener recalled, "He came alone. He left flowers. He said nothing." Back in England, Montagu's reports were sealed, his name erased from public recognition for years. The secrecy that had protected the mission now silenced its creators. Cholmondeley moved on to other intelligence work, his odd brilliance still invaluable in a world rebuilding from ashes. But sometimes, late at night, he would write letters to Montagu filled with wry humor and quiet reflection. "Do you ever think," he once wrote, "that our imaginary man lived more fully than most real ones?" Montagu kept that letter in his desk for decades. In post-war interviews, when he was finally allowed to speak, Montagu described Operation Mincemeat not as triumph, but as testament, proof that even in the darkest times, creativity could outmatch cruelty.
"The key to deception," he told one reporter, "is not lying. It's letting your opponent lie to themselves." Those words would echo through the halls of intelligence agencies for generations. Even years later, as the Cold War began and new forms of espionage emerged, the story of the dead man who won a battle without knowing it became required reading for agents in training. It wasn't just a tale of cleverness, it was a study in psychology, how the human mind, driven by fear and certainty, can be guided toward illusion. Psychologists would later cite Operation Mincemeat as an example of confirmation bias in wartime intelligence. The Germans believed what they most wanted to believe. And in that fragile space between belief and truth, Montagu built his victory. When he looked back on those days, he often described the experience not as thrilling, but quietly haunting. "We asked a dead man to lie for us, and he did." The words lingered in his memoir like a whisper. It was both confession and gratitude. The war would go on for 2 more brutal years, but the deception at Huelva remained one of its quiet turning points, a triumph of mind over might. And in the stillness that followed, long after the guns fell silent, the seas still washed gently against the Spanish shore, where a single grave marked the man who had fooled an empire, and in doing so, helped save a world.
Years passed before anyone outside the small circle of planners learned the truth about the man who had washed ashore in Spain. The world moved on, but within the walls of the Admiralty, the story of Major William Martin remained locked away, whispered only among those who understood what it had cost. Montagu continued his legal work after the war, his calm intelligence now serving a peacetime nation. Yet every now and then a shadow crossed his thoughts, the memory of a man who had never lived, yet changed the course of history. One rainy evening in 1951, Montagu was asked by the ministry to review declassified files for possible release. He paused when he reached the folder marked Mincemeat, Top Secret. He knew every page by heart. Inside were the memos, the letters, and the photograph of Pam. He held it carefully, as though touching a relic. The ink had faded, but the illusion still glowed with quiet perfection. By then, public curiosity about wartime intelligence had grown. The world had entered the age of Cold War espionage, and people were fascinated by the secret victories of the previous decade.
Montagu, encouraged by his superiors, began drafting a book. It would reveal the operation's outline but protect the sensitive details, a balance between honesty and duty. He titled it simply, "The Man Who Never Was." The phrase carried both irony and reverence. In the calm rhythm of his prose, Montagu described not only the mechanics of the deception, but the strange intimacy of creating a false life. He wrote, "We made him real, so that truth could wear a different face." When the book was published in 1953, readers were astonished. Many thought it too extraordinary to be true. Critics called it a detective story written by history itself. A film followed soon after. Audiences watched actors recreate the events with cinematic flair. The submarine, the briefcase, the body adrift. But beneath the entertainment, the real men who had lived it felt something quieter: melancholy. Charles Cholmondeley attended the premiere in silence, leaving halfway through. "They made it look easy," he muttered to a friend. "It never was." He understood that cinema could dramatize courage, but it could not capture the weight of waiting, the weeks of uncertainty when success or failure meant thousands of lives. The public embraced the tale as proof of British ingenuity, a symbol of cleverness triumphing over tyranny. Yet inside the intelligence community, it became something more, a parable about restraint. Deception, after all, is a dangerous craft. Once mastered, it tempts its user to trust illusion over fact. Montagu knew this and spoke often of the need for humility in intelligence work. He lectured young officers, "Never forget that lies, even righteous ones, leave marks upon those who tell them." The room would fall silent. Pens would stop moving. As the 1960s unfolded, new conflicts replaced the old, yet the lesson of Mincemeat endured, that imagination could be a weapon more decisive than steel. Across the ocean, intelligence schools studied the operation as a model of psychological warfare. Analysts dissected each choice, why the story had felt genuine, why the enemy had wanted to believe. They concluded that the secret lay not in the documents, but in emotion. The forged letters spoke in the language of friendship, love, and bureaucracy, utterly ordinary. That ordinariness was irresistible. In 1977, decades after the war, a British author investigating wartime graves in Spain uncovered something startling. The man buried as Major William Martin was not a career officer at all. His true name was Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man from Wales. He had died alone in London, without family or ceremony. In death, he had been given purpose, a soldier's identity, a lover's photograph, a hero's tomb. When the news reached Montagu, he was already an old man. Friends say he read the report quietly, folded the newspaper, and said only, "Then now he is known." The revelation stirred mixed emotions in Britain. Some felt sorrow that a life of poverty had been transformed only in death. Others saw poetry, that even the forgotten could shape destiny. Historians revisited the case not merely for its strategy, but for its humanity. Here was deception born not of arrogance, but of empathy, a strange form of grace in wartime cruelty. Psychologists analyzed it too, calling it the empathy factor, the ability of deceivers to think like their opponents, to feel what they might feel, and thus guide their belief. Montagu had instinctively understood that. To lie well, he once said, one must first understand truth completely. In 1981, when Montagu passed away, his funeral was small. On his coffin rested a single wreath of laurel leaves and a note from his colleagues. He served both truth and imagination. A few years later, a British naval attaché visited Welva once more. He arranged for a new inscription on the grave of Glyndwr Michael, acknowledging his true name beneath the alias. It read simply, Glyndwr Michael, served as Major William Martin, Royal Marines. His memory lives on. Visitors still come, leaving flowers and small flags. Locals speak of the Englishman who came ashore one morning and changed the war. Standing by that grave, one feels the quiet meeting of reality and story, the moment where fiction became fact and fact fiction.
The sea nearby remains calm, as though guarding its secret. Waves brush the sand with the same rhythm that once carried the body ashore. For historians, the operation remains a masterpiece of strategic deception. For storytellers, it is proof that imagination can be moral when used to save. But for the thoughtful observer, it raises gentler questions. What is the cost of shaping truth? And how many lives are hidden inside a single successful lie? War often demands heroes, yet here the hero had no heartbeat of his own. He was an idea given flesh, a message written upon mortality. In classrooms today, military cadets study the operation's logistics, the briefcase, the forgeries, the submarine's path. Few stop to think about the human beneath the uniform. Perhaps that is why the story endures, because it blends calculation with conscience and shows that victory can spring from compassion as much as cunning. Every few years, historians uncover a new document, a forgotten memo, a photograph from that time. Each discovery feels like finding another heartbeat of the man who never was. In one declassified letter, Montagu wrote to his superior, "If this plan works, sir, it will be because they saw not a ruse, but a life." That sentence encapsulated the soul of Mincemeat. Deception is powerful only when it reflects the deepest truths of what it means to be human: fear, hope, and love. The forged photograph of Pam, still preserved in archives, carries that same ghostly warmth. Her smile, staged yet sincere, became part of history's machinery.
The actress who lent her face never knew its impact. She only learned years later that her picture had helped divert divisions and save thousands of soldiers from ambush. When asked how she felt, she said quietly, "I suppose that's the strangest kind of fame, to be loved by someone who never lived." Her words echoed the emotional paradox at the heart of the mission, that even illusions can touch reality in tender ways. As the 20th century closed, Operation Mincemeat became more than a chapter in textbooks. It became a metaphor for the age, a reminder that information, not firepower, could change the world. In museums, visitors stand before exhibits showing the briefcase and the forged letters. Few realize they are looking at one of the earliest battles in the modern war of intelligence. Screens flicker with maps and faces, but behind them lies a single, enduring truth. Humans believe stories more readily than statistics. That is why Mincemeat succeeded, because it told a story the enemy wanted to hear, a story that fit their fears. Montagu's quiet genius was not inventing lies, but predicting faith, understanding how belief itself can be guided like a compass. He once remarked to a friend, "If truth is a weapon, then imagination is the hand that wields it." And as the sun sets over the Spanish coast, the grave of Major William Martin glows in the evening light. Half legend, half man, entirely human. The waves whisper his borrowed name, while history remembers him as both a question and an answer. The man who never was, and yet somehow
always will be.
Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of history. What once was secret becomes legend. What once was ordinary becomes profound. So it was with Operation Mincemeat, a deception that began with a single idea and ended as one of the most poetic victories of the war. In the decades that followed, the operation was studied not merely for its cleverness, but for what it revealed about human nature. It showed that wars are fought not only on battlefields, but within the fragile realm of perception. Every generation that revisited the story found new meaning in it. For some, it was a tale of ingenuity. For others, it was a meditation on morality, the uneasy balance between truth and necessity. At the Royal Navy Archives in London, researchers still handle Montagu's handwritten notes with quiet reverence. The paper, yellowed and brittle, carries the weight of an age when ink could change destinies. Among those notes lies a small card in Montagu's own handwriting. It reads, "A deception is not evil when it spares lives." He had underlined the word spares twice. To him, this distinction mattered deeply. The goal had never been cruelty. It had been mercy. Mercy, expressed in an unorthodox form. Today, in classrooms across Britain and beyond, young officers study Mincemeat as one of the most successful intelligence operations ever attempted. They trace the map lines, the coded cables, the reports, but they also discuss the ethics behind it. Was it right to use a real man's body for a lie, even one that saved thousands? Can morality be measured by outcome alone? These questions are left open, as they should be. A retired intelligence officer once said during a lecture, "What we learned from Mincemeat is that the truth, when weaponized, must still answer to conscience." The audience fell silent for a long time, because within every act of deception lies a mirror, one that reflects both the brilliance and the burden of human creativity.
In 2002, nearly 60 years after the operation, the British government officially recognized Glyndwr Michael as the man behind the myth. The news barely made headlines, but to historians, it felt like a final salute. A plaque was placed near his grave in Huelva, acknowledging both his real and fictional identities. Visitors began to come more frequently, some leaving flowers, others notes that read, "Thank you for your part in peace." For those who understand history, it is not the grand victories that linger, but the quiet acts of courage, even those born from deception. Standing by that grave today, one might imagine the scene in 1943, the early morning tide, the fishermen's voices, the briefcase heavy with falsehoods that would save lives. The air would have been still, the sun just rising, and the world entirely unaware that history itself was floating toward shore. In that moment, deception was not a crime. It was an act of faith. Faith in the idea that human ingenuity could preserve life rather than destroy it. When Ewen Montagu once wrote that truth is a tool, not a rule, he was not glorifying lies. He was acknowledging the moral tension of his craft, the weight of choosing between two evils and hoping the lesser one saved the world. It is that humility, not the cleverness, that gives Mincemeat its timeless resonance. Years later, intelligence agencies would adopt similar principles. Deception layered in plausibility. Humanity used as camouflage. But none ever carried the same haunting simplicity. A dead man, a briefcase, and a dream of peace. That was all it took to bend the tide of war.
The story reminds us that even the smallest decisions can ripple outward into history's great storms. In interviews late in life, Montagu admitted that he still thought often of the man they had used. "I wish," he said, "that I could tell him it worked." That single line carried the entire weight of the operation.
gratitude to the unknown, to the forgotten, to the man whose silence spoke louder than words. The photograph of Pam remained on Montagu's desk until his death. It had become more than a prop. It was a symbol, a reminder of the illusion that saved lives and the emotion that made it believable. When asked why he kept it, he simply said, "Because she reminds me that every lie must look like love to be believed." It is a thought that transcends espionage. In every era, from propaganda to digital misinformation, the most effective untruths are those that echo something deeply human. Modern analysts studying psychological operations often cite Mincemeat as the foundation of narrative warfare, a campaign not of weapons, but of stories. They say the battle for minds began there, with a single forged letter drifting through salt water. But to call it warfare alone diminishes it. Mincemeat was something more fragile, a moral experiment in how far imagination could go before breaking under its own weight. Even now, as documentaries retell the story and actors reenact the plan, there remains an undercurrent of reverence. Viewers sense that this was not trickery born of malice, but of necessity.
It was, in its own strange way, an act of compassion disguised as deceit. The success of Operation Mincemeat did not merely change military tactics, it reshaped the ethics of intelligence itself. It taught governments to ask, not only can we deceive, but should we? And yet, in the grand calculus of war, the answer is rarely pure. For those who must choose between truth and survival, history offers little comfort, only consequence. The men and women who wove such illusions carried those consequences quietly, often for the rest of their lives. Montagu once described it this way: "We walked a path between shadow and light, and sometimes, when the light grew too bright, the shadow was all we could trust." That reflection captures the moral landscape of an entire generation, people forced to build peace through paradox. Looking back now, with decades of perspective, one can see the operation as both triumph and tragedy. Triumph for its ingenuity, tragedy for what it says about the world that required it. In museums and lectures, visitors often ask, could such a deception succeed today? The experts answer cautiously, technology may change, but the human heart has not. Belief remains as vulnerable as ever, perhaps even more so in the digital age, when truth and fiction move at the same speed. Operation Mincemeat therefore feels strangely modern. It is a story about the architecture of belief, the psychology of certainty, and the quiet hope that intelligence can still serve humanity.
In that sense, the man who never was continues to speak, not from his grave, but from every lesson drawn since. He reminds us that the most powerful stories are not the ones we invent, but the ones we need to believe in order to survive. For the intelligence officers who followed, Mincemeat became both guide and ghost, a reminder that even successful lies demand remembrance, not celebration. At the Imperial War Museum, one display case holds the replica of the briefcase used in the operation. Visitors lean in close, whispering, as if the object itself still carries secrets. The air feels heavy there, not with grief,
but with awe, the quiet understanding that a single idea can travel farther than any bullet. Standing before that glass, you can almost hear the faint echo of Montagu's voice. Sometimes the truth must be disguised to reach the right ears. It is a sentiment both unsettling and profoundly human. Because even in peace, we are still haunted by the question of what truth is worth when survival is at stake. And so the story endures, retold by filmmakers, remembered by historians, pondered by philosophers, a timeless reflection on deception, duty, and the fragile architecture of belief. The waves of Huelva still lap against the Spanish shore. The grave of Glyndor Michael, Major William Martin, remains a quiet monument to the intersection of chance, courage, and imagination. As dusk settles over the sea, the story closes not with triumph, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the nameless man who became a hero by never knowing he was one, and for those who proved that even in a world at war, imagination could still serve mercy.